Well, here we are at ground zero of the monster camp Mayhem, which has continued to ravage the town of Harrison Hot Springs ever since Natural Gallant Bodybuilding started selling workout programs to the nearby residents. As you can see, I am surrounded by the forest in this area, and if you notice, you cannot hear any birds or any wildlife whatsoever because they have all been eaten as a supplement to the hardcore barbarian bodybuilder monstrosities which are inhabiting these woods. When one reporter asked why these monstrosities are eating all of the animals in the woods, they just got one answer. One can only assume that they need the extra protein for muscle mass. Well, there's one thing for sure. This reporter is not going deeper into the woods to find out if this reporter is a good protein source. I will continue to pursue this story in the nearby wilderness around Harrison Hot Springs. More at 11.
Train the muscles, not the joints.
Welcome back to Natural Gallant Bodybuilding Mountain. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a misunderstood subject in the fitness industry, and it was misunderstood by me for a long time. A lot of my youth I spent to try to find the perfect technique or the right way of doing something. And I stumbled across a few things that made me change the way I viewed exercises and the way I viewed what was right and what was technically wrong, right? The first thing is that if an exercise is injuring you or doing you harm in some way, you're obviously doing it wrong for you. There's some reason, whether it's because you're not flexible enough or because you're concentrating on the wrong muscles, or you say when you're squatting, you're pushing through the toes instead of the heels and stuff. There can be some general reasons of why you're experiencing pain. But one thing I've noticed is that people don't pay attention to the variables enough. And sometimes just by shifting one small variable, you could not only get rid of pain, but also concentrate on different muscle groups altogether. Or sometimes a certain technique that you're using is not wrong at all, even if it's causing you pain, but you might be using too much weight. Because some techniques are not for 4 or 5 rep sets. Some techniques will just injure you if you work in that rep range. But once you start using higher rep ranges, all of a sudden the technique becomes like the perfect technique for you and you start putting on muscle and strength. One example of this, which is an extreme example, would be an isolation exercise such as the skull crusher. Back in the day, I would try to apply the same techniques that I had with bench pressing or with bent over row or with squats, you know, a lot of my compound lifts. And I would start to do 5 rep sets or 6 rep sets or 8 rep sets with skull crushers. And I started to notice that one of my elbows would get inflamed from that. I would start to get some bursitis in my elbow. Now, I had broken this arm before, which compounded the issue. But at the same time, the first thing most people would say in that circumstance is, oh, this exercise is obviously crappy, or there's something wrong with this exercise. Or maybe I'm doing the exercise wrong, right? But the truth is I was doing the exercise with the same technique I use now, but the difference is that I changed the rep range. Once I increased the amount of reps to 15 to 20, in that area, I started to notice some results, and at the same time, the elbow pain instantly disappeared. Now, this same strategy can also be applied to some of your compound lifts. So for instance, some people squat with a certain width, right? Like if you're squatting a bit of a wider width, it might be easier for you to get down lower. Like right now I'm squatting with a pretty wide stance and I can get parallel for squats. The difference is when I squat like that though, I don't necessarily get my quadricep development that I want, but I'm getting a lot of adductor, hamstring, and butt development from it, right? So sometimes by making these little changes, you can get down deeper without problems with the knees, right? Whereas when I use a narrower stance, if I try to do the same depth, such as parallel, I'll get a lot of knee issues or knee inflammation, right? So although I'm not increasing the weight in either of these circumstances, I'm just talking about range of motion now. Just by making a small change in that exercise, I can continue to do it without throwing it out the door, right? Because a lot of times people are like, oh, squats, I hurt my back one time or I hurt my knees, that's it, squats are bad. They're not necessarily bad. You might have been just using too much weight or possibly the wrong technique for you. Maybe you needed to do a wider stance or a narrower stance depending on what you wanted. Now somewhere in my 20s or so, I started to use a bit of a narrower stance and I noticed that I couldn't go down as far in the squat, but I started to get better quadricep and outer sweep development from it. So I wasn't concerned about pleasing the powerlifting police or the powerlifting referees. I wasn't concerned about pleasing other people in the gym as far as looking proper, but I started to use the range of motion that started to increase the muscular size on my legs the most, as opposed to just achieving a certain depth. Now, I think it's good to switch up your techniques all the time. I think this is a very valid thing to do to make sure that you're correcting any imbalances or any muscles that become too tight or maybe shortened for whatever reason. But my main point is that there can be a number of variables that are contributing to you having a certain bad relationship with an exercise. And sometimes it's weight or it's the technique you're using. Now, more specifically, I find that a lot of people do not know that some exercises have a certain weight threshold, meaning intensity, and you cannot go above a certain intensity on that exercise without harming yourself, right? So just like I said about the skull crushers, once I started doing 5 rep sets or 4 rep sets, didn't matter how strong I was, once I started doing failure sets with that type of intensity, I automatically started getting some elbow issues. One could also say if you're doing a specific technique, maybe with an exercise like bench presses, maybe you are doing a little bit more of a flared elbow technique, you might get more chest development from it. But if you dare to do heavy weight like that, you will pull a pec or injure yourself pretty seriously, right? So you have to basically lower the weights in those situations if you're going to do a specialized technique to isolate a muscle, but you're not necessarily using your joints in the most efficient way, and you want to take that into account. So there is a heavyweight form on an exercise, and then there is a lightweight form, and they're not always the same. And that is where the big contradiction comes in. That is something that it took me a long time to learn, was that I would always go with the whole safety first type thing, and what is the technique that's going to make me look the strongest and lift the most amount of weight? What's going to be the most efficient to get the weight from point A to point B? And that was usually the safest on the joints and everything, but it didn't necessarily give me the results. And what I'm trying to say is that with bodybuilding, sometimes you have to choose to use a certain exercise with a adjusted technique, which can be dangerous if you're using heavy loads, but using lighter loads, it can actually hit the area that you're trying to hit and even rehabilitate an area specifically, like rehabilitate an injury, and it can be a very effective technique, but it's only effective when you're using lighter weights or lower intensities than you usually use. As you can see, these monsters have left this food source available for all the wildlife. Most likely it's a trap. It's a trap or some sort of bait that they're using to attract some animals so that they could nourish their voracious carnivore-like appetites. One thing's for sure, this reporter feels sorry for anyone who is dumb enough to wander into this trap. So yeah, don't be surprised if you can use a more aggressive or wrong technique that really isolates a muscle when you're using lighter weights. But when you're using heavier weights, you have to adjust that technique to make sure that safety is your first priority, and at the same time, you're not basically causing any sort of issues, right? And I think that using the heavy weight is also necessary because it creates a different sort of stress. And yes, the technique is different, but at the same time, I find that by using the heavy weights, you're hitting the body in a certain way, and then by using the lighter weights, you can really specialize and really try to hit those muscles in a way that would be dangerous otherwise with the heavier weights, right? So that's what I do. Like, so for instance, right now, I'm doing a lot of flat bench, but I'm doing more flared elbow technique. And the beginners on the internet, they always show me this. The beginners are always like, no, flared elbows, automatically dangerous, right? Automatically dangerous. That's exactly the way I used to think. It's only dangerous if you're using heavier weight or, moderately heavy weight. If you're using super lightweight for you, ultimately, that is going to be a safe movement. If you can do 20 to 30 reps, 35 reps after you're warmed up with the weight that you're using for that flared elbow technique, there's no problem, and you may get better chest isolation from it. My chest is actually growing from it, right? But I'm definitely not going to be doing a 4 or 5 rep set with that technique, because that would be too much stress on the pec tendons and definitely could cause a muscular tear or some serious rotator cuff problem. So you have to change your weight intensity depending on the technique and vice versa. And this is something that you can play with, and this will lead you to better results, and also finding the right technique or the right weight that is going to prevent you from getting problems or pain and injuries from certain exercises. So yeah, play around with the weight, play around with the range of motion, play around with the technique, and find out what is right for you. Don't get too locked into the proper technique if that technique is hurting you. And don't get too locked into pursuing strength at any cost if using those heavy weights is harming you. But know 100% there is a technique for heavyweight and there's a technique for lighter weight that might be more isolation based as opposed to lift heavy weight based. So that's really what I wanted to say. It's not so black and white like a lot of the beginners are trying to say, although sometimes it's good to start with that perfect template, you know, always, you know, tuck the elbows when you bench, always just squat to 90 degrees, always do certain things. But you're gonna notice at some point that you may have to venture outside those boundaries with some lighter weights in order to really hit the muscles that are not developing, or perhaps rehabilitate an area that you've injured. So yeah, I hope this helps you in your training. Thanks a lot for watching. And if you need to get a hold of me, just go to naturalgallantbodybuilding.com. And thanks to the Patreon supporters, there I have a podcast where I talk about this stuff at length. Mountain. And take care for now. I just noticed that I'm still filming close to the trap. I'm kind of stupid. You guys staying? Are you crazy? Are you like nuts? Natural